everybody, and welcome to my talk. So I'm Eric Wilkinson from McGill University, and I'm very happy to be here at Social Ontology 2021. Big thanks to the organizers of the conference and also to you, participants in the conference who have decided to watch my talk. So what I'm going to be talking about today, or the title of my talk, is a pragmatic constraint on nationhood. So I'm going to be talking about the ontology of nations and nationalism, the ontology of national communities, and methodologically how we can arrive at an ontology of nations. So to quickly get into an overview of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start by posing an ontological dilemma. So the question of what exactly nations and nationalism is and are in nationalism studies is quite fraught. Arriving at a definition of nation that's useful and not easily taken down is more difficult than you'd think it would be, considering the place that the terms nation and nationalism have in not just everyday discourse, but also a lot of our academic endeavors. Nation and nationalism as terms and concepts are very important, yet nailing down what precisely they are is notoriously difficult. So that's the dilemma I'm going to start with. I'm then going to talk about the pragmatic constraint, which is a methodological principle in the ontology of art, which I think has some insights relevant to nationalism studies and the ontology of nations. So after discussing the pragmatic constraint and what I think we can learn from it, I'm going to talk about what those upshots are for the ontology of nations and nationalism. In particular, how it will direct us towards assessing apparent nations and using that as the anchor from which our methodological inquiry into nations can proceed. So that's the overview of where the talk is going to go today. So let's start with that ontological dilemma. So the definition of nation is notoriously fraught and difficult to settle. The existing definitions of nation and nationalism all seem to be deeply flawed. More on that in a minute. So the difficulty of settling on a viable definition of nation has itself become a justification for certain definitional projects in the literature. As we'll see in a minute, the discursive definitions of nation in the literature use the difficulty of the question as a motivation for adopting their view. So we'll see how that's supposed to work in a minute. Today we're going to discuss some methodological considerations which I hope can help overcome this definitional impasse. So let's start by surveying some of the terrain in nationalism studies when it comes to definitions of nation. So let's start with objective definitions. So here's an example from Anthony Smith, the late Anthony D. Smith. So he says, a nation is a named human population sharing an historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, a common enemy, common legal rights and duties for all its members. So that's Anthony Smith, pictured here. So objective definitions like this often define nationhood in terms of certain objective markers, such as language, religion, ethnicity, territory, ancestry, history, or culture. The trouble with defining nation in this way is that you can always identify entities that are typically taken to be nations which do not have their boundaries determined by these markers. That is to say, the boundaries of apparent nations don't cleave along these different features. So to give you some examples, many nations have many different languages within them. Canada is bilingual. There are innumerable languages in India insofar as there is a single cohesive Indian nation. Many seeming nations throughout the world are multilingual. Similarly, many of them, contain people of many different religions, many different ethnicities. Physical geography doesn't usually cleave at the boundaries of national communities. A mountain range or a lake doesn't usually determine the boundaries of where one national community ends and where another begins. Insofar as it does, it's usually coincidental. And just as these characteristics tend to be shared between nations, individual nations tend to have many of them. The point here is objective definitions tend to fail because their boundaries are not, in fact, determined by these objective markers. So they can't be taken to be definitive of nationhood. So much for objective definitions. What about subjective definitions? So here are a few very influential ones. One from Ernest Renan, So Renan says, a nation is a twofold spiritual principle consisting of a shared memory of a common past and a willingness to continue to live together. So you can see there that it's subjective identification with the national community rather than some objective marker that makes it a nation. Sharing that memory and having that willingness to live and work together is what makes you a member of the nation. Benedict Anderson, in a very influential work, Imagined Communities, offers a similarly subjective definition. He calls a nation an imagined community, imagined necessarily as limited and sovereign. Limited and sovereign so as to differentiate it, hopefully, from other kinds of imagined communities. Now, the trouble with these subjective definitions is that they're too broad. So they could describe any number of communities other than nations. To start with Renan's, a shared common memory and a willingness to continue to live and work together. That could describe a religious order, an ethnic group, a curling club. All of those could be captured by this definition, so it's too broad. Even Anderson, who improves on it a bit, saying it must be imagined as limited and sovereign, would seem to capture any community that aspires to sovereignty in the political sense and is limited in scope, which seems to go beyond what national communities are. A religious order, and certainly many religious orders in history, have aspired to sovereignty and at the same time been limited in the sense of not suggesting they spoke for all of mankind. So in these ways, subjective definitions are fatally flawed in the sense of being too broad. It's the counterpoint to the objective ones, which are too narrow. So this brings us to discursive definitions, which are a more recent development in the literature, you might say. So proponents of discursive definitions point to the difficulty of defining nations as a motivation for adopting their view, because their view denies, strictly speaking, that there are such things as nations. So to give you a slight paraphrase of Craig Calhoun's view, under these definitions, nationalisms are discursive formations, a way of speaking that shapes our consciousness, but is also problematic, or we might say fluid enough, that it keeps generating more issues and questions. So there are no nations or nationalisms as such, no entity in and of itself. There's simply a way of speaking, a way of talking about this thing. There's simply the discursive formation. So for discursive theorists, as I've suggested, there are no nations, merely our talk about nations. And this is in part meant to explain the difficulty of developing an ontology of nation. It's difficult to pin down what a nation is because, in fact, there is no such thing that we're chasing after, is the suggestion. Now, unfortunately, the solution has some of its own problems. So, especially Umut Ozmakerli describes this as a meta-narrative, this discursive formation as a meta-narrative of nations, and the trouble is that to be useful, that meta-narrative must be analytically distinct from other kinds of communities. Otherwise, if it bleeds too significantly into other things, it's impossible to distinguish the discourse of nations and nationalism from the discourse of anything else. And that is a problem here, because there is significant overlap between the discourse of nations and nationalism and, say, the discourse of religious groups or organizations or ethnic communities. And while to some extent that might be expected, especially if you're dealing with the way people talk about nations, it gets to the point where we can't distinguish analytically between these different discourses, so it seems like there is no distinction to draw. In that way, this meta-narrative or discursive approach to defining nations and nationalism ends up leaving us without a definition that's workable, or any way of distinguishing when we're in a discursive stance of discussing nations and nationalism. So it too seems to fail. So although proposed as a potential solution to the definitional impasse found in nationalism studies, these discursive definitions are as fraught as previous ones, the objective and subjective definitions of the past. So I take it that the problem here is in large part methodological. What exactly we're supposed to be looking for in a definition of nation or nationalism is not usually clear. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to borrow some insights from the ontology of art, which I think can offer some guidance as to how this impasse can be overcome. So, to get started, the pragmatic constraint. So Davies argues that the ontology of art is bound by what he calls the pragmatic constraint, or PC. So here's a quote from Davies' work, Art as Performance. Artworks must be entities that can bear the sort of properties rightly ascribed to them in our reflective, critical, and appreciative practice, that are individuated in the way that such works are or would be individuated, and that have the modal properties that are ascribed to works in that practice. So, to summarize this, the pragmatic constraint maintains that our ontological inquiry into art must be guided by our critical and appreciative practice in order to fix the object of inquiry. So to get a little more precise, this is how the schematic of the pragmatic constraint looks. So you have an epistemological premise, which is that rational reflection on our critical and appreciative practice confirms that certain sorts of properties, actual or modal, are rightly ascribed to what are termed works in that practice. And then we get the methodological premise. So this is the pragmatic constraint, which is the claim that artworks must be conceived ontologically in such a way as to accord with those features of our critical practice upheld on rational reflection. So we get the epistemological premise, which is that there are certain properties of artworks that emerge in practice, and then we have the methodological premise, which says those are the features that we should take artworks as a category, an ontological category, to have, at least as they can be made consistent through rational reflection. So the ontological conclusion we arrive at is either the negative conclusion that works cannot be identified with X, or the positive conclusion that artworks can or should be identified with Y. So we go through these steps, we identify the properties that artworks have, and then we follow our methodological premise, which is our ontology should be guided by the properties that we identify in practice, and come to our ontological conclusion about what artworks are. So why is it necessary to adopt this pragmatic constraint? Why should practice, artistic practice, guide the ontology of artworks? So the pragmatic constraint requires that the starting point for ontological inquiry is artistic practice, because in short there's no alternative. Any ontological project requires topic-specific constraints that designate what the theory intends to account for. So, art, or an artwork, as opposed to water or religion. If you're providing an ontology of artworks, there has to be some topic-specific constraints, otherwise your ontology can't get off the ground. You don't have an object, a specific one that you're talking about. You can't give an ontology of artworks as opposed to an ontology of, say, water or what a religion is. So to quote Davies again, to offer an ontology of art not subject to the pragmatic constraint would be to change the subject. There's no alternative but to start from reflection on our artistic practice, because the very notion of art or an artwork is parasitic on that practice. So the PC captures this topic-specific constraint necessary to delineate ontology of art. So now the question is, can we specify the topic-specific constraints on the ontology of nations and nationalism? I think we might be able to. So the topic-specific constraint I would like to propose is apparent nations, the entities that we often call nations in everyday discourse. So, quite frequently, both in everyday language and in academia, we refer to nations and nationalism. And that, this is a fairly modest claim I think to start with, should be the starting point of our inquiry. We can use that to fix the reference of what we're talking about. Nationalism studies, this might not come as a surprise, already usually begins on the basis of analyzing these kinds of entities, but it's not always recognized or reflected on. And I think this fact is what leads a lot of ontological theorizing and nationalism studies astray. Because it's not attended to how exactly we're getting off the ground methodologically, it's easy to get lost. Or it's easy to end up building ontologies around very specific data points. So I take it this is why we end up with the specific articulations of the objective definitions, say, that we have. Because people identified specific things that nations tend to have, or things that tend to be emphasized in specific nationalisms, and then built their ontology around those data points or those pieces of evidence, without taking in the whole. And without being clear on what the methodology is that we're proceeding with when we're doing ontology, then it's easy to end up going astray in this way. So even this minor methodological stipulation takes us some way towards defining nationhood, as it explains the underlying problem with the definition we've seen so far. So as I mentioned, the problem with objective definitions is that they tend to take a few pieces of evidence or a few pieces of what are ascribed in our critical practice to nations and nationalism and build its ontology around those pieces. So for instance, nationalisms tend to form around, say, ethnic communities or languages. So a lot of objective definitions of nation tend to emphasize the role of ethnicity or language in the formation of a national community. These might not be necessary or sufficient conditions for forming a nation, but they tend to crop up quite significantly in objective definitions because they are definitely part of, many apparent nations that exist. And because they're prominent parts of those apparent nations, they become part of the objective definitions. This is also how objective definitions often become long lists of features, because they're trying to include all kinds of pieces of evidence or data points without getting down to what precisely the thing that unifies nations and distinguishes them from other communities is. Similarly, subjective definitions are too broad. So it's necessary that we narrow down what it is that specifically makes a nation and the properties that we ascribe to nations as opposed to other kinds of communities or other kinds of things, without it bleeding into those other kinds of communities, the definitions of those other kinds of communities. And this also becomes the issue with discursive definitions, this issue of broadness. So, in short, to overcome the definitional impasse in nationalism studies, having subject-specific constraints on ontological methodology is necessary. And this may not be, at least on the face of it, too immodest or controversial of a claim, that we need to impose these topic-specific, subject-specific constraints to make sure our ontological methodology is not leading us astray. Now, to determine these subject-specific constraints, I say we should look to the discourse of nationalism and what we might term apparent nations. So in both everyday talk and academic analysis, we tend to start anyway with apparent nations, communities, human communities that are taken to be nations. That should be the starting point for our ontological inquiry, just as apparent artworks and their properties are the start of theorizing an ontology of art. Now, this might go without saying, but the important is to start broad and then begin as you rationally reflect and arrive at a kind of reflective equilibrium in terms of your definition, you start parsing out, potentially, certain communities as not meeting the definition. So this isn't to say that every single piece of evidence or every single data point that we're given in everyday discourse has to be validated by the eventual definition we arrive at, but we do have to start with those things. So though our everyday discourse of nationalism and apparent nations should guide our ontology, this goes back to what I was just saying, we have to subject them to reflective equilibrium. So we might in fact end up with a fairly revisionary ontology of what nations and nationalism are, but we still have to begin, broadly speaking, with apparent nations and their apparent properties, and try to build a definition that as much as possible accommodates those properties. Now, I think that that's very much possible, and in some of my other writings, such as a paper that I have forthcoming in the American Review of Canadian Studies, I talk about what a somewhat revisionary definition of nations and nationhood would look like if we followed this kind of procedure. But, of course, there's not time to talk about all of that today. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you have the inclination and opportunity. But the main takeaway here today is that in nationalism studies, we have to be more particular and more explicit about what our methodological constraints are so that we can arrive at the definitions that we need to arrive at to make fruitful progress in this field. And that's more or less all I wanted to argue today. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.